The American frontier was no place for the faint of heart. In less than 7 decades, the United States expanded from the humble borders of its 13 original colonies, just 300,000 square miles, to claiming the entire continental landmass we know today. That's a staggering land grab of over 2.8 million square miles, one of the fastest and most aggressive expansions in human history. But this wasn't just a story of maps and treaties. What unfolded during this brutal era was a savage, relentless struggle for survival. Life on the frontier demanded more than courage. It demanded a certain kind of madness. The land was untamed, the threats constant, and the violence nearly unending. Settlers pushed westward through terrain that was often unforgiving, mountainous, arid, or swarming with danger. And they did it under the threat of near-constant conflict. War was a daily fact of life, whether with Native American tribes resisting encroachment with the harsh elements or with fellow settlers competing for resources. It was a land where law was scarce, alliances were fragile, and every day could be your last. This is not the glorified Wild West shown in old movies. Today, we're peeling back the myths and exposing the filthy secrets of the American frontier, from kidnapped daughters and tortured captives to rogue explorers and bear-fighting politicians. These are the stories of men and women who carved a nation out of wilderness and left behind a trail of blood, betrayal, and brutal survival. Daniel Boone is a name etched into the legends of early America. Revered as a fearless frontiersman, he helped pioneer the western frontier during the Revolutionary War. But behind the folklore lies a life of unrelenting danger, loss, and hard decisions in a land where survival often meant violence. In 1775, Boone carved a path into Kentucky through the treacherous Cumberland Gap, opening what became known as the Wilderness Road. It wasn't long before he founded the settlement of Boonesboro, but peace was fleeting. The year was 1776, and the Revolutionary War was burning through the colonies. British forces had allied with Native American tribes, fueling attacks on American settlers. That summer, Boone's 14-year-old daughter, Jemima, was kidnapped near the Kentucky River by a group of Shawnee warriors, along with 2 other teenage girls, Betsy and Fanny Calloway. The Shawnee, aligned with the British, had been tasked with raiding American settlements. The girls were taken deep into enemy territory, eventually arriving at a Shawnee village near what is now Chillicothe, Ohio. When Boone heard of the abduction, he didn't hesitate. He gathered a group of skilled men and tracked the captors for days through dense wilderness. On the 3rd day, they launched a surprise attack on the Shawnee camp. The raid was swift and fierce. Boone and his men shot several of the kidnappers and rescued the girls. It was the kind of daring rescue that would become part of Boone's growing legend, proof of his skill, resolve, and unshakable loyalty to his people. But Boone's life on the frontier only grew more dangerous. In 1778, Boonesboro came under siege by a large force of Shawnee warriors led by Chief Blackfish, supported by British officers. The settlers were outnumbered, outgunned, and rapidly running low on supplies. Even worse, some enslaved men who had been fighting alongside the settlers defected to the Shawnee, taking precious ammunition with them. Eventually, Boone and others were forced to negotiate a surrender. As part of the agreement, Boone himself was taken captive and brought to the Shawnee village. To their surprise, Chief Blackfish adopted Boone into the tribe, giving him the name Sheltoy, meaning big turtle. For months, Boone hunted and fished with the tribe, learning their language, customs, and way of life. He described them later as brave and generous warriors, but he was still a prisoner. When Boone eventually tried to escape, he was caught almost immediately. As punishment, he was stripped naked and forced to run a brutal gauntlet. 2 lines of warriors stood on either side, beating him with sticks and clubs as he passed through. Boone endured the ordeal, bloodied but unbroken. Months later, he was finally released and returned to his family. But the experience had changed him. Boone would later write about his time with the Shawnee in his memoirs, not just as a tale of suffering, but as a window into a culture he had grown to respect, even as war had placed them on opposite sides. Daniel Boone's legacy isn't just one of survival. It's one of enduring contradiction. A man who conquered the wilderness, yet learned to understand those who lived in harmony with it. Before Davy Crockett became a symbol of American folklore, he was a rugged survivor of the Appalachian frontier, a hunter, scout, and sharpshooting storyteller who grew up fending for himself in the wild. Born in 1786 in eastern Tennessee, Crockett came from poor farming stock and had to carve his own path from a young age. By 18, he was driving cattle across wilderness trails to markets in Virginia and Georgia. He quickly earned a reputation for his fearless spirit and uncanny wilderness instincts. One tale that helped define his legend comes straight from the realm of myth. The bear fight. In 1825, while hunting near his home, Crockett reportedly shot a massive black bear that didn't go down. Instead, it charged and knocked him to the ground. With only a knife, Crockett engaged the beast in a vicious struggle, stabbing it repeatedly until it collapsed. The story, true or not, cemented Crockett's image as a wilderness warrior who couldn't be tamed by man or beast. His fame soon extended beyond the woods. Crockett's folksy charm, raw honesty, and colorful tales of frontier life won him admirers and eventually a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He became a political celebrity, thanks in part to a satirical play called The Lion of the West, which featured a character clearly modeled after him. Audiences loved the larger-than-life portrayal of the bear-wrestling, gun-slinging hero with a heart of gold. The timing was perfect. Andrew Jackson's populist wave was sweeping the country, and Crockett seemed like its ideal poster child. But Crockett's political rise was anything but smooth. Though originally a Jackson supporter, he quickly grew disillusioned by the corruption, favoritism, and brutal policies coming out of Washington, especially the Indian Removal Act of 1830. At first, Crockett supported the act, believing it might offer Native Americans a fresh start away from settler aggression. But letters from his constituents in Tennessee and witnessing the unfolding cruelty changed his mind. He became one of the few voices in Congress to oppose it. In a bold speech, Crockett declared the act an injustice. He argued that the government had no right to force the Cherokee from their ancestral lands. His stance earned him both admiration and enemies. Ultimately, the act passed, leading to the infamous Trail of Tears, a forced march that claimed thousands of Native lives. Disgusted by the betrayal and politicking in Washington, Crockett left Congress and set his sights on a new frontier, Texas. In early 1836, he arrived in San Antonio and joined the ragtag group of volunteers defending the Alamo, an old Spanish mission transformed into a makeshift fortress. Alongside other legends like Jim Bowie, Crockett faced overwhelming odds against the advancing Mexican army, led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. For 13 days, the defenders held out, outnumbered more than 10-1. On March 6th, the final assault came. It was swift and brutal. All the defenders were killed, including Crockett. Some say he died fighting, musket in hand. Others claim he was captured and executed after the battle. Either way, his death became the closing act of a life marked by wild bravery, defiant independence, and a refusal to play politics at the cost of his conscience. Davy Crockett didn't just die at the Alamo, he became part of its legend. John C. Fremont wasn't your typical frontiersman. He didn't grow up wrestling bears or hauling wagons across the plains. He was a man of maps, compasses, and raw ambition, an explorer, a surveyor, and eventually a political firebrand who tried to bend the wilderness and the government to his will. He would go on to help chart the Oregon Trail, conquer California, and even run for president. But his path was as reckless as it was legendary. Fremont's early life was surprisingly formal for someone who would one day be nicknamed the Pathfinder. In 1833, he joined the U.S. Navy and served as a math teacher aboard the USS Natchez. It was during these early years sailing the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean that he learned how to navigate, chart, and survive. After being discharged in 1838, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked for the U.S. Bureau of Topographical Engineers. There, he began refining the skills that would soon make him a household name. Fremont's real fame came when he turned his compass west. Leading a series of expeditions in the 1840s, he played a pivotal role in mapping the Oregon Trail, helping settlers navigate the dangerous path to the Pacific. His detailed reports, illustrations, and endorsements of Western expansion helped fuel America's belief in manifest destiny, the idea that it was the nation's fate to spread from coast to coast. But Fremont wasn't just drawing maps. He was making enemies. In 1844, during one of his expeditions near the Great Salt Lake in Utah, Fremont and his men stormed a Native American village without warning. They destroyed homes, burned crops, and killed several people. A year later, while exploring Northern California, a stolen horse led Fremont to order a deadly assault on a Klamath Indian village, razing it to the ground. These brutal acts became footnotes in his glowing government reports but cast a long, violent shadow over his reputation. Despite his treatment of native peoples, Fremont was paradoxically an abolitionist. He supported the end of slavery, and his later political career reflected this tension. In 1856, he became the first-ever presidential candidate for the newly formed Republican Party, running on an anti-slavery platform. But it was during the Civil War that Fremont made his boldest political move. In 1861, as the military governor of Missouri, he issued what became known as the Fremont Emancipation, an executive order freeing all enslaved people owned by Confederates in the state. It was a powerful statement, a direct strike against slavery from a battlefield commander. Abolitionists celebrated it, but not everyone was thrilled. President Abraham Lincoln, fearing it would drive the border states into the arms of the Confederacy, asked Fremont to scale it back. When Fremont refused, Lincoln removed him from command. The two would later reconcile, and Lincoln reassigned him to a post in Virginia. But the incident revealed just how unpredictable and defiant Fremont had become. He was a man who charted the unknown, but refused to follow orders, a self-declared patriot who made his name through conquest and cartography, and nearly lost it to controversy and ambition. John C. Fremont didn't just help create the Oregon Trail, he helped reshape the map of America, one battle, betrayal, and bold decision at a time. Before dime novels turned him into a living legend, Kit Carson was just a boy from Kentucky with a restless heart and a hunger for the wild. Born on Christmas Eve in 1809, Carson would grow into one of the most famous and complicated figures of the American frontier, a fur trapper, wilderness guide, Indian agent, and soldier. He wore many hats, and he wore them all hard. At 16, Carson ditched his apprenticeship as a saddle maker and joined a caravan of traders heading west to Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a wild leap into the unknown, but it set the course for the rest of his life. In Santa Fe, he found work as a fur trapper and mountain man, navigating the Rockies in search of beaver pelts, surviving on grit, instinct, and whatever game he could hunt. He quickly became known for his survival skills, his ability to negotiate with native tribes, and his uncanny sense of direction in the wilderness. Throughout the 1830s, Carson served as a guide for several expeditions into uncharted territory, including those led by Captain Benjamin Bonneville and the adventurer Ewing Young. But it was his partnership with John C. Fremont, the ambitious explorer and future politician, that launched Carson into national fame. Acting as Fremont's scout and right-hand man, Carson helped map vast swaths of the American West, his quiet resolve a perfect contrast to Fremont's fiery ambition. Carson's fame exploded thanks to a series of dime novels written by DeWitt, C. Peters, starting in the 1840s. These cheap, dramatic stories portrayed Carson as a fearless hero, an almost mythical warrior who fought off savage beasts and hostile tribes with ease. Though the novels exaggerated his exploits, they captured the public's imagination and turned Carson into a symbol of American ruggedness. By the time the stories stopped printing in 1897, he had become a household name. Carson's legend reached beyond the printed page. He served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, where his knowledge of the terrain gave American troops a major advantage. During the Civil War, he fought for the Union, commanding troops in the New Mexico Territory. He even held the title of Indian Agent, a role that placed him at the center of tense negotiations and violent confrontations between settlers and Native American tribes. But Carson's legacy is far from clean. Though he once lived among tribes and married Native women, his later military campaigns included the forced relocation of the Navajo during the Long Walk of 1864, a brutal, deadly march that displaced thousands. The contradictions in his life are sharp. A man who lived with Native peoples then led campaigns against them. A figure celebrated as a hero, whose name is also tied to pain and displacement. Despite the controversy, Carson remained a towering figure in frontier folklore. He was even immortalized in film and video games, portrayed as the quintessential mountain man in Hollywood westerns, and referenced in titles like Red Dead Redemption. Kit Carson's life wasn't a fairy tale. It was violent, raw, and often morally complex. But in many ways, he was the frontier, untamed, dangerous, and unforgettable. By the mid-1840s, the American West was teetering on the edge of transformation. The U.S. wanted California, Mexico held it, and John C. Fremont, with Kit Carson by his side, was about to light the match. In 1842, Fremont and Carson first met in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Fremont was preparing another Western expedition, and Carson, already a famed tracker and guide, was exactly the man he needed. Their partnership would lead them not just across deserts and mountains, but into one of the most audacious land grabs in American history. In late 1845, Fremont, Carson, and their expedition party entered Mexican-controlled California, where American settlers were already stirring with talk of rebellion. Tensions between the settlers and Mexican authorities were razor-thin. Fremont, though still officially a private citizen, carried himself like a general. He made contact with the Americans living in the region and quietly began preparing for something bigger. Carson served as a scout and messenger, helping Fremont communicate with the settlers and assess the political climate. Soon, Fremont and the Americans in California moved from whispers to action. In June 1846, a group of settlers, emboldened by Fremont's presence, seized the town of Sonoma and declared independence from Mexico. They raised a crude flag stitched with a single star, a bear, and the words, California Republic. Thus began the Bear Flag Revolt, a brief, chaotic attempt to create an independent California. Though Fremont never officially led the revolt, he provided weapons, ammunition, and encouragement to the rebels. When U.S. forces later swept into the region during the broader Mexican-American War, they easily took control of California. The Bear Flag Revolt was over in weeks, but its impact would ripple across history. The fallout, however, was far from clean. Fremont was court-martialed for acting without government authority. He had essentially led military operations as a private citizen, without orders. Worse still, he was accused of executing prisoners without trial and treating Mexican civilians and native tribes with unnecessary brutality. Despite these charges, Fremont's political career survived. He spun his actions as bold patriotism and was later appointed a general, even running for president. As for the Bear Flag itself, rough, hastily drawn, and stitched by rebels, it became a lasting symbol. The California Republic didn't survive, but its flag did. Today, a version of it still flies as the official state flag of California. The conquest of California was as much about ambition as it was about ideals. Fremont and Carson helped secure America's claim to the Pacific, but they did it with a mix of unauthorized rebellion, opportunistic warfare, and blurred lines between heroism and insubordination. In the end, what began as an off-the-books expedition became a turning point in the American expansion. A bear flag raised in defiance. A land changed forever. The Oregon Trail is often remembered as a path to hope, a rugged highway to a better life in the West. But for tens of thousands of pioneers, it was a trail of suffering, disease, and death. Over the course of America's westward expansion, nearly 1 in every 10 people who set out on the Oregon Trail never made it to their destination. It's estimated that 10,000 to 30,000 people died, leaving behind a haunting average of 20 graves per mile. The reasons were grimly varied. Accidents like being crushed by wagons or thrown from horses, brutal winters and freezing temperatures, starvation and dehydration, diseases like cholera that spread like wildfire through wagon trains. Some were killed during conflicts with Native American tribes defending their land, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion, never to rise again. But out of this hardship emerged figures who would shape the folklore of the Wild West, including one of its most infamous outlaws, Butch Cassidy. Born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866 in Utah, Cassidy would go on to become a legendary bank and train robber and the leader of the Wild Bunch Gang. But long before his notorious reputation, his very existence was a product of frontier resilience. His parents, Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Gillies, were Scottish immigrants who crossed the Oregon Trail as part of a group of Mormon pioneers seeking sanctuary in the Salt Lake Valley. Their journey was marked by desperation and tragedy. They were part of what became known as the Mormon handcart migration, a cost-cutting, disastrous experiment in frontier travel. In 1856, Mormon leaders encouraged converts to use handcarts instead of covered wagons, believing it would make the journey more affordable. What followed was one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the history of American migration. Two handcart companies with nearly 1,000 people left Iowa City far too late in the season. As they crossed the high plains of Wyoming, a sudden early winter engulfed them. With limited supplies, minimal shelter, and no protection from the brutal cold, the pioneers began dying in large numbers. Many were so weak from starvation they resorted to chewing on leather from their shoes and belts just to stay alive. Over 200 people died, and countless others suffered from frostbite and permanent injury. Miraculously, Maximilian and Anne survived. Their endurance through that nightmare allowed them to settle in Utah and raise a family, including the son who would become Butch Cassidy. The irony is sharp. Parents who braved death to build a future in the West gave birth to a man who would spend his life robbing trains and banks across it. The Oregon Trail didn't just forge new towns or expand the map. It forged people, hard, unbreakable people who carried trauma, grit, and rebellion into the next generation. Some became farmers, some became legends, and some, like Cassidy, became outlaws molded by the unforgiving land that almost took their parents' lives. When people talk about the great frontiersmen of American history, names like Lewis and Clark rise quickly. But none of their accomplishments would have been possible without a young woman whose courage, intelligence, and resilience made the journey west not just possible, but successful. Her name was Sacagawea, and she may be the most essential guide in American history. Born around 1788 into the Lemhi Shoshone tribe in what is now Idaho, Sacagawea's childhood was cut short by violence. At around the age of 10, she was captured during a raid by the rival Hidatsa tribe and taken to their village far from home. There, she was either sold, or possibly won in a game of chance, to a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who made her one of his wives. Though little more than a teenager, Sacagawea was already fluent in both Shoshone and Hidatsa, and that linguistic skill made her invaluable when the Lewis and Clark expedition passed through in 1804. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had been commissioned by President Jefferson to explore the uncharted Louisiana Territory and find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They needed interpreters, and Sacagawea became the key to their success. Despite being pregnant, Sacagawea joined the Corps of Discovery as they began their treacherous journey. She wasn't just a translator, she was a peacekeeper, a survivalist, and an unshakable symbol of diplomacy. Her presence often reassured native tribes that the expedition was peaceful. After all, no war party travels with a woman and an infant. Perhaps, the most legendary moment of her journey came during a near catastrophe. As the expedition made its way down the Missouri River, one of the boats capsized in a rush of whitewater. Inside it were critical maps, journals, tools, and navigational instruments, the intellectual lifeblood of the entire mission. Sacagawea, traveling in a separate boat with her infant son Jean-Baptiste strapped to her back, jumped into action. She leapt to the riverbank and without hesitation began retrieving supplies as they rushed past. Thanks to her swift thinking, most of the priceless documents were saved. She even managed to reconnect the expedition with her long-lost Shoshone people, who, in a twist of fate, were now led by her own brother, Chief Kamyawait. Because of Way, her Lewis and Clark secured horses and safe passage through the Rockies. Without that connection, the expedition might have stalled, or ended entirely, in the mountains. And all of this while carrying, birthing, and nursing a child. Despite her enormous contributions, Sacagawea was long relegated to the footnotes of frontier history. But over time, her legacy has grown. She has appeared on currency, statues, and in classrooms, finally receiving some of the honor she long deserved. The Lewis and Clark expedition may bear the names of two men, but it survived and succeeded because of one young native woman. Sacagawea didn't just guide them west. She carried the future of American exploration on her back. The American frontier was not built by clean hands or perfect heroes. It was forged in blood, grit, contradiction, and ambition. Behind every iconic name, Boone, Crockett, Fremont, Carson, Cassidy, and Sacagawea, lies a messy truth. These weren't just adventurers. They were complex, often flawed individuals who survived a brutal world and, in doing so, reshaped it. They lived in a time when the line between survival and savagery was razor thin. Boone rescued his daughter but also tolerated slavery. Crockett fought for the rights of Native Americans but died defending a territory seized from another nation. Fremont mapped the land for settlers while destroying native villages along the way. Carson married native women, then led campaigns to drive their people from their homelands. Cassidy's outlaw fame was born from a trail paved by tragedy and sacrifice, and Sacagawea, arguably the most heroic of them all, was enslaved, exploited, and yet remained the expedition's quiet savior. What we call the Wild West wasn't just wild. It was dirty, violent, opportunistic, and unforgiving. It was also a place of impossible determination, raw courage, and human extremes. The myths often clean up what history refuses to forget. These filthy secrets of the frontier don't just tell us about how America expanded, they reveal the cost of that expansion. So the next time you hear the word frontier, remember, it wasn't just a land waiting to be discovered. It was a battleground for survival, betrayal, and legend. And the people who crossed it didn't just build a nation. They left behind a trail of truths we're still trying to understand.